welcome to the launch of DNV's Energy Transition Outlook China. No matter where you live, China's energy transition impacts us all. It is the largest investor in green technologies, and its solar panels and electric vehicles are being exported around the world. China is today responsible for a third of the world's energy-related CO2 emissions. In the next 45 minutes, we would like to take a closer look at how this will develop until 2050. You will first hear from our Group President and CEO, Remy Eriksson, and our Energy Transition Research Director, Sverre Alvik, who will run you through the highlights of the report. We have invited two experts on China's energy transition, who will then discuss the findings of the report together with Sverre and me. If you're watching live on LinkedIn, you can leave a question in the chat and one of our experts will answer. But now I would like to give the floor to Remy Eriksson, DNV's Group President and CEO.
Thank you, Ulrike. Welcome to the launch of DNV's forecast of China's energy transition through to 2050. As some of you may know, we have tracked and modeled China's transition since our first energy transition outlook 7 years ago. And we have included views and reflections on that in our annual outlook each year. But this is the first time that we have published a standalone report of our forecast for China. The fact that our report is so comprehensive, running over 120 pages, owes much to the hard work of our forecast team, but also the very valuable insights from our DNV experts in China and to our network of external experts there. The publication of this report, with events in Beijing and Shanghai this week, is one of the ways we are celebrating DNV's 160th anniversary year. But there is a deeper reason for producing such a comprehensive report, of course. It is impossible to understand and forecast the global energy transition without the understanding and forecasting the transition in China. China's emissions reduction trajectory and its position as a leading supplier of clean technology worldwide are central aspects of the global transition. No one who has visited China regularly over the past decade or so, as I have done, will have failed to notice the skies above the cities becoming clearer and the streets increasingly filled with electrical cars and buses. These are the visible signs of a vast decarbonization effort. From a position where China currently is responsible for a third of the world's energy-related CO2 emissions, by 2050, that share will have reduced to a fifth. In absolute terms, China's emissions will reduce by 70%. As we show in this outlook, this is related mainly to the replacement of coal by renewables in the power mix and the electrification of end-use demand. The scale of change is hard to picture, but literally, mountains of coal are going to be replaced by many square kilometers of solar PV and thousands of wind turbines, both onshore, fixed to the seabed, and floating. Together with storage technologies, renewables are going to do the job of making China's energy use not only cleaner, but greatly more efficient and more independent. I will leave it to my good colleague Sverre Alvik to take you through our findings in more detail. So I will close with just a couple of points. The first is that no one should underestimate the scale of the challenge that China is undertaking to move its economy off coal dependence. China's goal is carbon neutrality by 2060. Our forecast shows China failing a little short of this goal. However, with more focus and effort, we believe the goal is achievable. Our forecast reveals a still sizable reliance by China on oil, gas and coal by 2050, which leaves room for accelerated progress. Since decarbonization and energy security pull in the same direction for China, there is a logic behind moving faster. The Paris Agreement goals are, above all, a shared undertaking by the world's nations. Without cooperation, all future generations face a truly distressing future. I'm proud that DNV provides some of the glue that fosters such cooperation through our technical work with the world's energy leading companies. The fast movers in decarbonization all over the world, including China and across critical supply chains. Thank you for attending this webinar, and I hope our China forecast inspires action. And now I hand over to Sverre Alvik to run through the key highlights of the report.
Ladies and gentlemen, over the next 15 minutes, I'll give you a snapshot of something which is quite challenging. How will the energy transition of China unfold over the next decades? Of course, I will only manage to give you a very condensed version of the developments. I encourage you to download the Energy Transition China report, which is available as of today. But why is China's transition so important? Well, China is a big country, and a quarter of the world's energy use is used in China. And that's a share which will almost be maintained at the present level. On the emission side, a full third of the global CO2 emissions comes from China. And although that will reduce to about a fifth in 2050, the share is so big that it's influencing the climate future for all of us. And since it's so big, China also has an opportunity to a larger degree than other countries to influence its own climate future, a factor which is quite motivating for climate change action in China. As many of you know that has followed DNV's energy transition work for some years, you know that DNV is presenting a forecast and not a range of scenarios. That's not because we know what the energy future will look like, but because not all futures are equally likely. And in this forecast, we are looking at the most likely development within policy, technology, economy, and behavioral change. And we put these most likely developments into our energy transition model and model China's transition as part of the global one. We're doing this in DNV's research unit, but with great help from our colleagues around the world, and of course, particularly in China. And we also have had great help from Chinese experts in institutes and in universities with this work. So let's look at the results. Today, China's energy mix is dominated by coal. Actually, 56% of China's energy use is coal, and that's half of the world's coal use. But over the next decade, this is changing dramatically. And already now, we see that solar and wind is the cheapest form of new electricity in China. And towards 2050, the shares of solar and the shares of wind are going to dominate the changes coming. In this slide, you also see that overall energy use is peaking. And that's happening in China. Is that surprising? Well, we'll try to explain why. In this little complicated graph, you should look at everything which is below zero as a decrease in energy, and everything which is above zero as growth in energy use. If you look at GDP or GDP per capita, China have had a strong growth for many decades. We've seen values up to 8% growth per year. That is now on its way down, and it's going to continue down. As all other mature economies dominated by the tertiary or service share, efficiencies in growth are much harder to achieve. And we expect an economic growth per capita of 1 to 2% per year over time. The second factor influencing energy use is the number of people. And the number of people in China have already peaked, and in 2050 it will be about 100 million less than today. And then the third factor contributing is energy intensity. And historically, energy intensity has reduced with about 1 percentage point per year. But now, with help of electricity and electrification, the reduction is more than 2% per year in China. And with continued electrification, it will continue to be above 2 percentage points a year. When you multiply these three factors, you get the overall energy use. And as you see from the line in this graph, it's peaking around 2030 and then reducing thereafter. Another very important goal of the Chinese climate and energy policies is energy independence. And most of the energy in China is domestically produced, but not the oil and the gas. Most of the oil and gas is imported from Middle East, Russia, and other areas. Coal use in China will reduce and will to a large degree be replaced by domestically produced renewables. Oil use will also reduce, but gas use will slightly increase before it peaks around 2040. But China will continue to import both oil and gas. And continued oil and gas use is therefore the main reason why China is only partially achieving its goal of energy independence. Overall, fossil fuel use, as you see in this graph, is declining dramatically, and fossil fuel share is reducing from 86% today to 40% in mid-century. Electrification is a very important feature of the energy transition. And the share of fossil fuel in power is reducing from 2/3 to only 7%. Again, it's dominated by coal? No. But in 2050, it will be dominated by solar and wind. An absolute share of electricity is also growing from 25% today to 47% in 2050. You also see nuclear on this slide, but it's relatively small. Well, it's small compared with solar and wind, although it's not small in absolute terms, and it's more than doubling from the present level. Not only is China producing solar and wind for domestic use, it's also producing a lot of clean energy technology for the rest of the world. And in that sense, it's a key enabler for the transition happening elsewhere. The large majority of the world's solar panels, wind turbines, electric vehicles and batteries are produced in China. We see that the geopolitical realities also is a challenge in this respect, and protectionism is growing in North America and in Europe. And for example, we now see European or EU politicians looking into subsidies to EVs or wind turbines to see if there's unfair subsidies altering or changing the competitive landscape of European industry. But although protectionism is making an influence, China is going to continue to produce clean energy equipment for the rest of the world, and in that sense help the rest of the world to achieve its emission reductions. Then looking at emissions. China has two major goals on emissions: to peak emissions by 2030 and to achieve carbon neutrality by 2060. When we look at the most likely developments, we find that the peak by 2030 will be achieved. In fact, we find the peak to be already in 2026. And thereafter, we expect a steady reduction in CO2 emissions over the coming decades. If you see the angle of this curve, we see that we're almost on track towards carbon neutrality by 2060, but we need to do some more, especially in the manufacturing sector. If we look at relative emissions, China today emits around 8 tons of CO2 per person, a level which is much lower than US or North America, but also higher than in Europe. And that's where it will be placed also in the coming decades. Lower than North American emissions, but since China has a much lower price on carbon than Europe, emissions per person will also be significantly higher than the European ones. Looking at all emissions, the development is not fast enough. We have a fast, but not fast enough development. And although China is helping on the global transition, all countries, including China, must further accelerate the transition. And that can be done by further means within policy, technology, economy, or behavioral change. And we highlight here policy and behavioral change as the two areas where there is most potential to do more. If China succeeds with a faster transition, that also will have benefits beyond the climate targets, and including lower use of oil and gas, and hence increased energy security. So to summarize, energy independence is very important in China, but will only partly be achieved when you replace domestically produced coal with domestically produced renewables, but continue to import oil and gas. Overall energy use in China will peak by 2030, and continued electrification and improvements in energy efficiency is driving energy use down thereafter. China's renewable installations will grow by a factor of 5, and solar and wind will green the electricity mix. China will continue to manufacture clean energy technology and help the world with approaching its emissions targets. And then China's emissions, they are likely to peak before their 2030 goal and thereafter reduce almost at a level achieving their carbon neutrality 2060 goal, but more can be done to further accelerate it, and that will also have other benefits, for example, on energy independence. This report and all other energy transition report you can download from the DNV website, and we look forward to your continued feedback and interaction. Thank you.
Thank you, Sverre. A quick reminder that you can ask questions in the chat and our experts are at hand to answer them. Now we're going to dive deeper into China's energy transition and its wider impact with two experts. From China, we're joined by Guo Shan, a partner at Hutong Research. For more than a decade, she has been analyzing China's industrial policies and advising multinational companies. In the studio, I'm joined by Iselin Stensdahl. She is Research Fellow at the Fridtjof Nansen Institute. She is an expert in China's climate and energy policy. And our Energy Transition Research Director, Sverre Alvik, is also joining us here for the discussion. Welcome to all of you. I would like to start with a focus on policy. Shan, how much is China's energy policy related to addressing domestic concerns such as air pollution, or has it been driven more by external factors like the Paris Agreement?
First of all, thanks for inviting me to this session. It's very glad to see this China in Energy Outlook being launched, and it's a very important topic that we discuss here. And it's a great question. We got a lot from people asking whether this is internal or external, and my answer would be both of them matter. If we look at China's policy trajectory, starting from 2005, actually, China started looking at decarbonization as one of its targets. If you dive into the 5-year plan, that's the plan that China make for long-term planning of its economy as well as the society. It's already included the energy targets, decarbonization targets into the 5-year plan starting from 2005. And that's after the Kyoto Agreement, actually, long before the Paris Agreement we talked about. But only in recent years, because of the air quality in Beijing worsened so much that you hear a lot of internal discussion on how to make China better, how to improve the environment. So that really accelerated the policy efforts trying to address these concerns. And in 2018, we have this Blue Sky campaign in Beijing that really helped a lot in improving the air quality in China. And starting from then, we do see a lot of policies on the ground trying to make the change. And we also see officials succeeding in making those changes are being promoted. So those efforts actually incentivize the policymakers to do more in this area. And then most recently, we have President Xi's commitment to decarbonize China and made at the United Nations discussion. So that was very important, another external factor for China to pursue further acceleration of its decarbonization. And starting from 2021, there have been more efforts trying to make this green transition happening. And so over looking at all these histories, I would say both internal and external factors played a huge important role in China's decarbonization policies.
Thank you, Shan, for those insights. I want to move over to Iselin. How has China managed to accelerate the build-out of green industry so quickly in comparison to other countries? Is it just scale?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And Shan already mentioned, the renewable energy law from 2005, which is close to 20 years ago. And I also dug up for some research. We found in the late 1990s, already then, there were plans as to how can China start with the renewable energy industry. So it's been a long road, and it's definitely very much top-down driven, government driven. And it's been supported with, subsidies and in the electricity production feed-in tariffs. But I would also like to mention, which is this is quite, I think, unique to China, the willingness to innovate and to have trial projects, pilots. Is a very sort of it's a trait of Chinese policies.
And they're quick, yeah?
Very quick. Yes. But of course, scale matters as well. Yeah, China's big, so it's sort of easy to become the #1 green jobs country or like the most installed capacity.
Yeah. A follow-up, maybe Shan touched upon it a little bit, but how does China gain support for the energy transition from households and consumers? You mentioned subsidies, but yeah.
Yes. So I think this sort of also relates to maybe sort of the social contract. Yeah. Like the party state delivers a better life for its citizens, and that's. But again, I would say it's a lot of driven from the central state. I mean, I've been living in China for several periods of time, And I remember in like 2010, 2011, 12, there was a lot of advertisements on the subway, like low carbon lifestyle, low carbon travel. So I think it's been, it's definitely driven from the top. Yeah. But there's also, I would say, a growing population. That air quality was mentioned by Sean. It's very important. You know, if you can't breathe, everybody needs to breathe. But I think the maybe more higher educated, more developed population perhaps feels this is more important. Yeah. Whereas in the more rural areas, I think it's seen as a price to have a lower air quality for development.
That's right. Sean, just a follow-up, because in Norway, you know, we've managed to, you know, introduce a lot of electric vehicles because of subsidies. I don't think that advertising, you know, alone would have managed to, you know, get us to where we are now. In terms of kind of incentives in Shanghai specifically, for instance, you mentioned something in an earlier discussion about incentives there.
Yes, Shanghai has been doing a lot. So in China, there are several cities that have limit quota for getting a license plate for your cars, because these cities are very crowded and very polluted, and people want better air quality. So there is a control of the license plate you can get for your car. And in Shanghai specifically, if you have an electric vehicle, you don't have to use the quota system to get your license plate. But if you have a fossil fuel vehicle, for example, then you have to line up for the quota, or it's a bidding system. You have to pay for the license plate, and that can be very expensive. So with this kind of incentive in place, people naturally prefer green vehicles, electric or plug-in vehicles as an alternative to fossil fuel. It's a lot cheaper. It's easier to charge in the cities, and if you don't drive long away, then it's good enough.
Very good, very good. Let's look at China's role in the broader energy transition, and I'm looking at Sverre. You showed that China's massive green tech build-out will drive down costs of renewables. Affordable green technology is important to accelerate the energy transition, but could the growing concern over energy and economic security in other regions hamper the transition?
We have had an advantage of uninterrupted global technology cooperation for many decades. And the geopolitical realities now are putting some strains on that. And energy transition is one out of many priorities in all countries, in China, in Europe, in North America, in Brazil, and everywhere. So when there are conflicting priorities, something will suffer, and national interests, jobs, national stability, security, defense overall is also influencing this, and we see that the tension is growing a little bit. So yes, it can influence or hamper the transition, but it will not stop it, because there is a lot of pragmatism in all countries for this. And although you would like to maintain your own industries and have a fair competition, and that is influencing the picture, you also want to continue trade, and you want to buy from where it's cheap available. And it's no secret that a lot of the main reason why China has been a manufacturing powerhouse of the world is that the costs has been low. That is not likely to change dramatically. So yes, it's influencing it, but it's not stopping it. And China producing for the rest of the world, helping driving costs down, will also continue.
Very good. Sean, China has prioritized energy independence, also something Sverre mentioned earlier, but our forecast suggests that it will only be partially achieving the goal of energy independence in 2050. What's your take on that finding?
Yeah, I agree with this funding. I mean, it really depends on how you define energy security. To be honest, I also agree that one country cannot get rid of trade, and you just cannot produce everything yourself. So it's very important to understand how you can pursue energy security in a sustainable way. And in my view, China is doing this by diversifying its energy supply instead of trying to produce everything itself. If you look at oil is the biggest. Many people argue is the biggest uncertainty for China's security, at least nowadays. And China still imports 70% of the oil it consumes. But its strategy is not to produce a lot more within its domestic market because it knows that oil is not the energy for the future. It is importing more, but importing from different countries. That's what diversification means. It imports less than 20% of the oil it total import from. No country makes up more than 20% of China's oil import. So that's how China secures its oil supply. And I think the same logic will apply to other energy supply, no matter what energy we're talking about.
Thank you. Iselin, to follow up on that, we forecast that fossil fuels will still play a major role, as said, in China's energy mix by 2050, especially with natural gas being at about the same level as today. But does it create concern that China relies on importing oil and gas? Does it matter where it comes from? Similar question to Sean, but I just wanted to get your perspective as well.
I agree with Sean. I think it's yes and no. It matters in the way that China doesn't want to be too, reliant on one source.
Not get into the German situation that
exactly.
we had.
But as Sverre also mentioned, they're very pragmatic.
Yeah.
So I don't think it matters too much where exactly it comes from, as long as it's not too much from one source.
Yeah. Okay. And Sean, just to also stay at this topic, I'm just also interested in if energy independence is a key driving force, how self-reliant are China's green energy supply chains? So a bit of a focus on supply chains.
Yeah, supply chain is a very long thing if we talk about the renewable energy manufacturing. Of course, China manufactures most of the solar power equipment it consumes, and as well as the electric vehicles it consumes. But if you look at the supply chain, the auto supply chain in particularly is very long, and you can't produce everything along the supply chain yourself. And just one example, lithium, China imports around 80% of the lithium it consumes. It's not a mine-rich country, so it has to rely on import for the supply of its batteries, which is the critical component of the electric vehicles. And the same logic also applies to solar power. When we say China dominates the solar power supply chain, we also need to remember that for a lot of the raw materials, the chemicals that is put into the solar power products, it's also China relies on imports. There are some chemicals that China relies 50% of it consumes on imports. So it's really a global supply chain that everyone is benefiting from it.
Yeah, and Sverre, your research team, when you prepared the report, you looked into supply chain and the market. What's your take on this?
A supply chain is another of these areas where there now is quite a few changes, and most countries, as Sean tells us, are not producing or sourcing all the minerals and metals and everything they need domestically. So
even though there's the trend for home shoring and local production, yeah.
Yeah, there is, and of course, if you have a metal or a mineral yourself, you now have more incentives to do it. We saw during the pandemic, for example, that you don't want to be too vulnerable on one source of delivery, and that's also to do with security and geopolitics. So there is an increased attention of not being too dependent on one country also elsewhere. And if China is dominating the sourcing of rare earth metals and other things, the production and refining of it, then we see increasing trends that people want to source this from other countries also. So they go to Africa or Latin America or areas where there is materials available and try to make deals The Chinese has been very good at this for many decades in Africa and elsewhere. And now Europe and North America is waking up and wants to do the same. So yeah, we call it home shoring or friend shoring or near shoring, and it has to do with diversification of supply elsewhere as well. So this is a global trend in China, but also elsewhere.
Yeah, but there will be global sourcing also going forward.
Yes, and as we said, the pragmatism, where can you get it? Cheap, and most countries benefit from global trade, and that is not stopping. It's just a little complicated by the geopolitical situation.
Iselin, China is largely on course to meet its goals to be carbon neutral by 2060, but for the world to be net zero by 2050, it needs to accelerate to reach that goal quicker, according to our analysis. Is there a motivation to decarbonize even quicker? How do we get China to decarbonize by 2050?
Yeah, I think there's a willingness there, absolutely. The thing is, for reaching peaking carbon emissions by 2030, there's been, maybe decades already of modeling and planning, but exactly how we reach the 2060 goal is more uncertain at this point of time. But I think, if China could achieve earlier than that, that would be a great achievement. And it fits very well with, Xi Jinping's a green pillar in his thoughts and the ecological civilization. So I don't think China's sort of that they don't want to reach it earlier. But as we see, COVID was another sort of example where the carbon emissions rose more than sort of expected. So there can be other things in the future that hinders the transition. But I think the intention is there.
Yeah, it's just a very tough goal.
Yeah.
Sverre, you mentioned in your presentation that China can influence its own future more than other countries. Can you elaborate on, are we seeing this is happening?
Yes, and to just explain a little bit of that background.
Yeah.
The tragedy of climate is that it's so hard to influence your own future. If you want to protect a forest or take care of your own health, it's something you can do locally or personally. If you want to achieve less climate change, how can I as individual or a small country contribute? They only represent a tiny share of the global emissions. But China represents a full third of the global emissions. And with a central government that now is focused on this, it actually means that it can influence sort of a third of its future, a much larger share than any other country. So this is an incentive which helps the Chinese governments and China as a country to not only care about the climate, but also to understand that we can influence our own future. And of course, we should also continue with international cooperation and UN and IPCC and everything around that. But what can be done locally is more effective in a large country, and with a central government view on this, they have their ability to influence their own future more than other countries have. And let that not be an excuse for other countries not to act. That's not the point, but it's a clear motivation.
Makes a bigger impact, yeah. Jean, I want to give the final word to you, actually, because, we've talked about, the big impact of China on the global energy transition and the big responsibility as well. So what's your take on, being even more ambitious, more policies, quicker technologies?
Yeah, I think China is already doing a lot of the acceleration of its own policies and actually work on the ground, but it wouldn't promise to that because as the speaker mentioned, there are a lot of uncertainties in the future. Who knows what will happen in the next 4 decades, and probably another pandemic will change things. So China's goal is still to maintain the current commitment, which is to reach carbon neutralization by 2060. But but we already see a lot of the efforts to move things quicker so that if anything happens unexpectedly, there is room that China can still manage to achieve its own goal. And just to give you an example, one is China's solar power installation. Last year, China added 217 gigawatts of solar power installation last year. So the original target was 90. But then China managed to add over double the amount of the original plan. And this is double the size of the entire solar power installation in the EU and the US. So adding them together is not as much as what China did last year. So this is already faster than expected, although it's not reflected in the headline data yet. Because of COVID, because of a rebound of activities last year, people travel more, people do more air traffic, which still causes quite some emission. But we do see that there are a lot of efforts on the ground that are trying to make the environment and climate better.
Sean, thank you. Those are impressive numbers. And I would just say, China, keep up the speed. And we all need to travel less because, of course, the hard-to-abate sectors still, are a challenge for the energy transition. Thank you to all our panelists. It was great that you could share your insights, your expert insights here today. It was much appreciated. And thank you for all of you watching. You can download the Energy Transition Report for China and all the other ones that we have published on our website. And I wish you a nice day. Goodbye.